Okay, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, in what seems like an astronomical length of time since I last spoke to today's guest. I'm happy to inform you that I am rejoined by Dr. Brian Keating. Now, for anyone who hasn't heard of Brian before, he is a Chancellor, or the Chancellor's Distinguished Professor of Physics at the Centre of Astrophysics and Space Sciences in the Department of Physics at the University of California, San Diego, public speaker, inventor, and an expert in the study of the universe's oldest light, the cosmic microwave background. And he uses that to learn about the origin and evolution of the universe. Now, Brian is a writer and a podcaster, and you can catch him every Tuesday, I believe. A new video goes up over on YouTube. This is one of the best YouTube channels I watch, ladies and gentlemen. If you're into science, and I imagine if you're watching this show and you follow me, you probably are, you need to be following Brian because he gets on some of the best guests from the science world. He's also a best-selling author as well, and we've spoke about his book before, Losing the Nobel Prize. Well, he's back with us today. He's got a lot to say about Galileo, and I can't wait to catch up with this guy. So without any further ado, Brian, welcome back onto the show. And like I was saying to you beforehand, since we last spoke, it feels like we're now living in the space age. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing good. I've been keeping entertained by watching you and all the great, awesome stuff you're doing in this multiverse of minds that we're connecting together on the internet. You know, someday my dream is to like meet you in person. I've so many people I've been blessed to meet over the last year of pandemic podcasts, and only about maybe 10% have I ever met in person. It's crazy. So it's kind of been an opportunity. It's kind of been a challenge to everybody on Earth. Some much more than others, but hoping we're going to get through it soon and be on the other side and meet up in real life, because that's what the world's about. It's not about these two-dimensional, black mirrors that we stare into or talk into. So looking forward to another great chat today, brother.
Absolutely. And I would rather come to your location. Definitely a far sunnier climes than it is over here, Brian. But no, I suppose we should really be grateful that all of this has happened at a time when we can connect like this, Brian, right?
Yeah, I mean, just 5 years ago, someone was saying, I think online somewhere, was like, yeah, if this lockdown happened 5 years ago, I would have killed myself because there was no Netflix, or it hadn't scaled up to the level it is now. Zoom hadn't really gotten to the pinnacle of its capabilities as it is now, YouTube, etc. So I don't think people would have killed themselves. I mean, I think there are other things to do in life than just kind of maximize your use of technology. But by the same token, it has been an amazing tool. I actually am candid about it on my podcast. I got my start, of almost about a year ago with my first real podcast. I started off the year with 100 subscribers, 2020, and ended it with close to 20,000 over that now. And trying to really emulate you and the other pro YouTubers that show how quality, how kind of not ever underestimating your audience. You never dumb it down. And that's what I respect about you. I never do want to do that. I always want to keep it high level, because I feel as a scientist, I have a moral obligation to spread the knowledge of science. And that's what I've been focusing a lot on lately is, what do we learn from science? What should we trust science to do for us? Should we put blind faith in science and scientists? Is there a healthy degree of skepticism? How do you balance, the truth versus, this pursuit of truth, which is provisional, skeptical all the time? And so those are questions I'm grappling with. And yeah, I've been blessed to have on some of the most brilliant people in the world, and it's growing. It's growing as fast as the universe is expanding.
You talk about Galileo, and I want to get into that, but it's quite interesting because we're talking about 400 years ago. And you would think that we would be a lot more civilized, a lot more advanced, a lot more intelligent today, dare I say it. However, when I look around the world, Brian, It feels to me like skepticism has maybe gone too far. And you talked about a balance there, you know. It's almost as
Yeah.
if we're back in a time now, or we're approaching a time where anything scientific is met with too much skepticism, in my opinion. But what do you say to that? Where have we gone wrong? Have we got too much information at our fingertips now?
I don't think it's that. I think it's that my colleagues, many of whom are unwilling, unable, and really perhaps incompetent to spread the truth of the gospel of science. And that doesn't mean science is always right. In fact, it's usually wrong. And that's the job of a good scientist. But what we do is a terrible job. We say, oh, yes, you're right. When you think of us as geniuses, you're right. And you cultivate an air of invincibility, of intellectual invincibility. Now, it's not to say that someone with no scientific training can come up to me and just revolutionize all of cosmology, all of astrophysics. No, not at all. You need to have a background. You need to have studied the history, the technology, the pace of growth of knowledge in this field of science, whatever your field may be. But I think it's kind of the opposite. You know, scientists spend so much of our time studying in the lab, communicating, if at all. You know, the old joke about scientists is, how do you know a scientist is outgoing? Because he looks at your shoes when he talks to you. And from my perspective, you know, scientists have some mythology associated with us, but we cultivate it, and we do so at our peril, because in America, we have a concept of separation of church and state, which is a great thing. We don't have a theocracy here. We don't have rule by unelected, clerics, and we don't also have to worry about the government coming down and telling us what we may or may not do in church, synagogue, mosque, etc. However, we always say that separation of church and state is good for the church. It's not only good for the state to not have these theocratic rule, but it's good for the church, because now they can operate without coercion by an all-powerful government. Those are great things, and I love that about America. I love my country so much. However, I think nowadays we've come to a situation where we have a need for the separation of science and state. We have a problem, which is that funding is trickled out in ever decreasing amounts to a very small cadre of scientists who have deeply, built up connections, and in some cases were very well deserved, but nevertheless the innovation, the outsider's thinking, the beginner's mindset, the Zen mindset is not really flourishing the way it once did back in the times of people like Galileo. So I'm on a crusade, to mix metaphors, to get separation of scientist and state. We should have support of science. We should be free of government overlords telling us what we should research. And part of that begins with not letting the government use our research for its own purposes to advance a political agenda that we were never elected to do.
Very, very well said, brother. Well said. Now, you mentioned the church there. And that brings us nicely into Galileo, what you've been talking about a lot lately. I learned a lot from listening to just one podcast that you were on with Prager University. I had always been under the belief that this was one of the most persecuted characters in the whole of history. Talk to us about Galileo, Brian, and what it is that you really look up to in him.
I love Galileo. He's my number one hero of science. You know, people venerate Einstein. You ask, who did Einstein venerate? He venerated Galileo. In fact, Galileo was the first physicist, really, of the modern age. He was the first observational astronomer to use a telescope. And he was the first person to come up with a concept of relativity. How do you gauge the motion of various observers as they go out in their business and travel at different velocities underneath a boat, as he talked about in the hold of a ship, all the way to birds flying around in the air? How do you judge their scientific contributions? Galileo is held in the highest esteem by none other than the person that most of us think of when we think of the genius, and that's Albert Einstein. What's great about Galileo is, like Einstein, is like me, is like you, Kev. He was a man. He was a human, and he had great flaws. He had great ideas, brilliant ideas, but he had brilliant blunders as well. And some of those impelled him to do things that were not scientific. And it goes to show, if someone as bright as Galileo can make certain mistakes, can make blunders called confirmation bias, trying overly hard to justify a hypothesis that he had coined or created himself, which was correct in truth, but the evidence for which he presented was absolutely flawed and known now to be a great blunder. If someone as great as him can make a mistake, so too can a schmuck like me make a mistake, as I have been and as I have done. And it shows you just the power of mistakes. And as I write about in my book, Losing the Nobel Prize, it's okay to lose. Most people lose. We just had the Super Bowl last night in America. Well, there's like 50 guys who are like total Shaq, Diesel. I mean, these guys are huge brothers. I mean, they are amazing. And they're the most elite athletes in the world. And you know what? They lost. They're losers, right? No, they're not losers unless they don't learn from what they did not do to create a victory for themselves. Now, in science, there's no absolute victory. We can never win. Football, American football, you guys call it, is a zero-sum game. One wins, one loses. However, science, I've been talking about this a lot, science is the infinite game. There's no winners or losers. And the good thing is we can always win battles. We can never win the war. We can win the battles because our enemy is Mother Nature, and she is always in retreat. She may have an infinite army that's powerful beyond all human comprehension, but we can make progress every single day, such that even a failure, like I made many, many of them, or Galileo has as well, they lead to future battles and future victories. We just might not be alive to see the fruits of our particular labors, but that's okay.
So, Brian, you mentioned that his evidence or the way he got there was kind of flawed. What do you mean by that? What did he do wrong? How hard was it for him to get his ideas across back then?
Well, I talk about Galileo a lot also in my book, because take yourself back to 1630, 1621. Back then, the prevailing opinion was that the Earth was the center of the universe, the center of the solar system. Everything else went around us. And that had prevailed for 2,000 years. Since a man by the name of Aristotle and Ptolemy and others came up with the idea of the Earth-centered universe. So I always like to point out, when you hear these words in America, we hear them a lot. Trust the science, trust scientists. Well, I like to say, Aristotle was a scientist. It turns out almost everything he said scientifically, except for I've only found one or two things he was right about in science. And they were not like, things that you use on a daily basis. He was the first person to scientifically prove that whales were not fish. Okay, that's cool. That's important. But on the same token, he also thought that heavy objects fell faster than lighter ones. He thought the Earth was the center of the universe, et cetera, et cetera. He did much better in math and poetry and logic than he ever did in science. Nevertheless, he was a scientist, and his ideas prevailed for thousands of years until Copernicus conjectured that the universe was not centered on the Earth, it was centered on the sun, which, by the way, is wrong also. The universe isn't centered on the sun any more than it's centered on the Earth. It's just more true than saying the Earth is the center of the solar system. It's much more true to say the sun is as close to the center of the solar system than not. So what Galileo did is he observed the moons of Jupiter in 1610. Just about 411 years ago this week, he discovered these little stars orbiting around Jupiter, which he very sycophantically, like a teacher's pet, he named them after his patrons, the Medici family of northern Italy. But anyway, he knew that what he had shown was not that the Earth was the center of the center of the solar system. All he could show at that observation, with all in quotes, was that the Earth wasn't the only center of the universe. He didn't prove that the sun is the center of the cosmos. So that was left to his next book. So in 1610, he produced a book called The Starry Messenger. In 1632, even after being forbidden to publish on this and to teach it, he published another book called The Dialogue on the Two Chief World Systems. But that wasn't its original title. The original title of the book that Einstein called perhaps the greatest book in science history, that title originally was On the Flux and Reflux of Tides in the Earth's Rivers, Lakes, and Ferns. I don't know what a fern is, but maybe you have some ferns up there in
we've
Scotland.
got
I'm not
lots
sure.
of them over here. Yeah, they make up our
Yeah.
lovely, colourful countryside. Yeah.
Yes, that's lovely. Yeah. So we don't have too many of them here, but I'll take your word for it. I trust you
You
implicitly as
don't.
my fellow
They're full of
scientist of life.
beasties. They're full of like ticks and horrible little beasties. You don't want to get caught in the fern. No.
Are there any monsters in there? Any
Unless you're
fern
up by
nest
Loch
monsters?
Ness, maybe Loch Ness, just there.
So he originally wanted to call it that weird title. That title meant that he thought the tides on the ocean, like we have here in beautiful sunny San Diego, we have tides twice a day, high tides, twice a day, low tides. He said that was because the Earth rotates on its axis and goes around the sun. Bingo, proved it, nailed it, except there's one problem. He is completely, unequivocally, uncategorically wrong. He is completely misguided by this desire to prove something which is true, namely that the Earth is not the center of the solar system, and it is true that the Earth goes around the sun. However, the evidence that he used, so much so that he wanted to title his book after this incorrect, confirmation bias driven title, was completely wrong. So that was the kind of morass that he got into. And you know who helped him out and changed the name of the book to something much more intriguing and kind of gripping, and that was the Catholic Church. They said, no, call it the Dialogue on the Two World Systems, and it stayed that way ever since. And many people thought because of this book he was tortured to death, or thrown in jail at the dungeon with the key tossed
That's
away
what
and
I've
put on the
always been under
racks.
the impression of. The darkest, horriblest hole under the Vatican.
Yeah, he was not. He was allowed to move not only back to a palatial villa that is so nice, Kev, that I held a conference there in 2015 to discuss what's called Galilean relativity and other phenomena. It has grape vineyards. It has olive trees. He was able to not only do astronomical observations, he was not only able to write another book very similar to the Dialogue, which, that shouldn't have been impossible. And some say that was his greatest contribution to physics, was his last book called The Discourse on Two New Sciences. Sounds very similar, right? So, I don't see in America, we've got, Bernie Madoff, and we've got all these, these awful people, and they're in like, solitary confinement, or Jeffrey Epstein, they're put in these spider holes. This guy was put in a place so luscious, so lovely, that it has a view of, overlooking downtown Florence. And not only that, they permitted him to live very close to his beloved daughters, who were nuns in a nunnery about a kilometer away from his prison. So he was treated pretty fairly, I would say. And by no means was he tortured.
It sounds to me almost like that the Vatican came in and took over where the Medicis left off. It sounds like they gave him the perfect kind of life, so he could concentrate and think about his next book,
And from my story, you know that I'm Jewish, but I was actually raised Catholic, and I was actually an altar boy in the Catholic Church. And one of the things that always appealed to me about the Catholic Church is that the Vatican operates a huge telescope. And this telescope called the Vatican Observatory, it's like 3 meters across. It's an enormous telescope. And why are they interested in it? Because they believe that they can get a window into the mind of God or Jesus Christ or whatever by exploring the world around us via nature. Now, it wasn't like the Pope back then. By the way, the Pope Urban VIII was very educated and actually had been tutored by Galileo at some points, and they were friends. And the only thing that the church had told him in 1616, so 16 years before he published the Dialogue, as they said, you can't teach the theory of the Earth not going around the sun. You cannot teach that. What you must do is only teach. You must only study it, but not teach it. And by that they meant that you could only write about it in scholarly, journals or magazines or books or whatever, and that meant writing in Latin. As I discussed in Losing the Nobel Prize, he took it on his own authority that he could then violate that order. He would not only do research, he would not only learn about it, but he would teach it. And by teaching, he would publish not in Latin as the Starry Messenger was, which is called Siderius Nuncius. And I know you speak fluent Latin every day over there,
Yeah.
but I had to look that up. But he wrote the dialogue. Their title is the Dialogo. It's written in Italian, the popular vernacular of the day. Therefore, he was teaching. And that they couldn't stand by. And imagine if like you, Kev, know for sure that that there's this pandemic and it's coming to kill everybody on Earth, and only you can protect against it, and you have this true knowledge and you're guaranteed and super sure, you would almost be morally obligated to tell everybody in the most stringent of terms to be safe, to take care of themselves, whatever, wear masks, take this, take that. And so the Vatican had an obligation. This was like an existential threat to their security and to their stability. So, I'm not a huge fan of what they did, and they actually never pardoned him officially. So I don't want to come off saying the Vatican is flawless and so forth. They just said that they removed this suspicion of heresy, which was actually granted in a way to not force him to be tortured. If they said he was heretical, he would have been tortured. I actually made a mistake when I gave my TED Talk. I gave a TED Talk about Galileo, and you can find online. But it wasn't only about Galileo. It was kind of the precursor to my book back in 2014. And in this story, in my TED Talk, I start off by saying, imagine if the greatest mind of his day, Stephen Hawking, the late great Stephen Hawking, was thrown in jail for thought crimes. And I put this like bar slamming shut on it. So I was wrong. I actually didn't know that he hadn't been put in an official jail. And here I am, a professional scientist, in love with Galileo. So how much more so can the general public be misled that Galileo was a martyr for science against the evil, indoctrinating Catholic Church? It's just not true. And so part of my love affair with this book, the Dialogo, that I'm going over, and some exciting news for your listeners, is that book, the Dialogue, had a huge effect not only on me, some nobody, but Einstein, Stephen Jay Gould, the greatest minds in history after Galileo, and Isaac Newton. But no one's ever made an ebook, like a Kindle or whatever PDF version of it, and no one's ever made of the definitive translation of it, and no one's made an audiobook of it. So I kind of took it on myself as an homage to find out if I could get the rights to publish this book as an audiobook for the very first time. And the audiobook rights are owned by my home university, University of California. And so I went back, and the definitive translation by a man by the name of Stillman Drake, professor at UC Berkeley, our neighbors to the north here, and I secured the rights to make the first audiobook, and I'm doing it in consultation and combination with several Italian physicists, including just recently I got Carlo Rovelli. I don't know if you know who he is. He's one of the most famous physicists.
Yeah, Rovelli.
Yeah, so he's going to read the introduction from Galileo in as beautiful Italian accent. So stay tuned for that. That's going to take me a while to do, but in the meantime, I'm doing stuff with Carlo Rovelli on the Into the Impossible podcast, which is on all major podcast venues, as well as my YouTube channel, Dr. Brian Keating.
Yeah, that sounds absolutely awesome. Listening to you talking about Galileo there, then it's almost like he was one of the first whistleblowers, because he made he almost made the information available to people that it was never intended for, right?
That's right. The Italian and the Vatican was so powerful. It was sort of an empire, which had scientific emissaries, and like I said earlier, it wasn't like Aristotle wasn't a scientist. He was a scientist. So do you trust him? I have a problem with that notion of trust when it's used as a shorthand for obey. In other words, if I say trust, if I'm your doctor and I say trust me, you've got stage 1 lump on your backside. You better listen. You better trust. But do you just trust, or do you get a second opinion? Well, what about in a case where you don't have an opportunity? Like, where do you get a second opinion about wearing masks from? I mean, how do you do that? And I wear a mask, obviously, but we had conflicting information. We just had a study I read in Nature that just came out that said it's not super effective to wipe down surfaces for prevention, I'll just say, of certain types of viruses. Okay, I'm not going to speak specifically. So, but my wife, every time she goes to the supermarket, she wipes down, hoses down, disinfects, chlorinates, does whatever on every piece of fruit,
Yeah.
and is it going to do any harm? No. But my point is, when you listen to scientists in a way that you obey us, when I tell you about a black hole in a distant galaxy, it's not going to affect your life, Kev.
Yeah.
It might inspire you. You might like it, but it's not going to dominate you. It's such that if you don't obey me, you could have some negative repercussions. So
Exactly.
I worry about that when there are scientists, especially like leaders of scientific guilds and countries or epidemiologists in your country, who'll come out and say something based on a model. And maybe this is useful for us to discuss. I haven't really talked about this much, but there's a difference between a theory. When I say to you, Kev, the evolution is a theory. What does that mean? What do you think that means? At the end, I'm going to ask you some questions, by the way, for my podcast, Kev. I hope it's okay.
I would say
now I'm going to take.
Would that not be, if it's a theory, it's not, is it not something that you can replicate and you can test time and time again and get the same outcomes?
Well, it's not that. No, a theory in science is about as clear-cut, slam dunk, evidence proven fact that we can be. You can never be completely 100% sure of a given scientific fact. For example, if you say the Earth is flat, it looks flat, but there's evidence that it's flat, but actually there's way more evidence that it's flat than it's spherical just to your eyes. But we won't get into that.
No,
but you're actually wrong.
Please don't say that. Please don't say that. No, you don't want to go there.
Okay, I'm not going to go there. But there's evidence, but visual evidence, don't be led astray, as the Bible says, by what your eyes make you prostitute to. Okay, I'm not going to get into that. But if you say the Earth is a sphere, you're also wrong.
Yeah.
You're wrong, because it's not a perfect sphere. It has a squishiness. It has a bulge at the equator from rotating around. It has tidal force. Anyway, it's not a perfect sphere. But you're less wrong than if you say it's flat. And so science is always provisional in the sense that you come along and correct things that are in the past. So you'll never be able to say that the theory of evolution is the same as the Pythagorean theory, which is proven in mathematical terms. To the extent that you can prove something self-consistently, as Kurt Gödel showed, is incomplete, but nevertheless, you can prove it to a mathematical degree of certainty. There's no such degree in physics that you can do that. But to the best of our knowledge, the theory of gravity, the theory of relativity has been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. So when someone says to you, that's just a theory, that is actually very high praise. It's actually saying about as much as you can possibly say. The theory of evolution is as true as a scientific fact can be measured to be true. Now, of course, there'll be corrections to it, as we know, but then there's a difference between a theory, which has been observed, makes predictions, confronted with new facts and data, and then built up consensus around. There's a difference between that and a model. A model is a prediction of the future based on perhaps a theory combined with some observations. So, predicting the future is pretty hard to do if you haven't noticed. And so you might want to be skeptical of models that make you obey certain behaviors and certain, so you had this famous thing in your country when models predicted there'd be 2 million people dead, blah, blah, and all this stuff, and then it did not come to pass. Now the question is, what happens to those scientists? What happens to those politicians who mandate certain behaviors based on models, not based on theories? If they say, the vaccines are safe, it's proven this way from the theory of evolution or DNA structure, you should trust that. But if they say, we predict that if you don't do X, Y, and Z, that so many people will die, because fundamentally you cannot falsify that. You cannot prove that wrong because it occurs in the future.
Yeah.
And so I have problems with global warming people when they talk about models or what's going to happen. I believe that man is causing global warming. I believe it in the core of who I am as a scientist. There's multiple directions of evidence, et cetera. But where I part ways is when those models predict how I should change my behavior and how the world should alter its behavior. I bring up this example that the number one problem in Wall Street, the center of financial power on the planet 100 years ago, 120 years ago, was horse crap. Traders couldn't get into the stock exchange because the streets were filled with manure. There was bacteria, there were parasites. It was like a very dangerous place to go to work. It's still dangerous, but for different reasons we won't get into. But nevertheless, and so imagine you're back then, you're like, we got to find a solution to this, or the models predict all the traders will die in 10 years and we won't get to have the Great Depression. And they say, well, we're going to make horse diapers and we're going to make, self-scooping horse. No, that wasn't the cure. That wasn't the solution. It was innovation. And so too, do I hope that we already know there are ways to innovate our way out of global warming. And it's called nuclear power. There's high efficiency turbines, wind turbines. There's natural gas. There's many ways we can avert it, delay it, postpone it, flatten the curve of global warming. And what I worry about is that people are not going to believe in global warming because they're going to say, you guys made up all this stuff about masks not helping, and then masks were helping, and then like washing surfaces, and then it doesn't matter if you wash it. So why should we believe you about something that we know to be happening like global warming? I'm very afraid about that. So, be careful when someone tells you to change things based on a model of what could possibly happen, and be very much more open when they talk about something that's theoretically possible and has a lot of evidence for a hypothesis that's essentially been verified. Just always think about the theory of evolution or the theory of gravity.
Yeah, it's a strange time for science, Brian. It truly is. But I was going to ask you, what are you looking forward to from an astrophysics kind of point of view in the year 2021? Because there's a lot of space stuff happening, dude. A lot of space stuff.
Yeah. What's so cool is that we're getting on my podcast, I'm getting people, I've had 9 Nobel Prize winners come on and talk about their research. And the thing that really exemplifies, the Nobel Prize spirit to me, and I'm actually writing my second book is going to be called Winning the Nobel. No, it's going to be called Think. It's going to be called Think Like a Nobel Prize Winner. And it's going to be the tools and tactics and tricks that these great minds that you're showing up there on the screen right now have used to overcome and battle through obstacles and challenges. They're human beings too. And if you want to learn from the best and brightest, these are the people to look to. And so how do they come about it? And they're as passionate as they have ever been about unraveling the mysteries of, as we're talking about, the fundamental composition of the universe. So on the screen now is like Frank Wilczek, just to the right of the arrow right now. He won the Nobel Prize in 2004. This is an amazing guy. Barry Barish, who won the Nobel Prize, and Ray Weiss. I've had them on, and these guys have overcome so much, waiting till their 80s, from the time that they invented something, maybe in their 30s, 40s, 20s, in the case of Frank Wilczek. And how do they persevere? How do they endure? How do they have the resilience to do that? And the thing that keeps them going is a passion for the science. So for me, I'm very passionate about potentially unraveling the imprint of a universe that might have existed, not definitely, by no means is there evidence yet for doing this, but there could have been a universe that existed before our universe. And Stephen Hawking believed this in some sense. Sir Roger Penrose, who won the Nobel Prize, I'm speaking at his 90th birthday party in August about ways that we can prove, or perhaps more accurately, prove him wrong. That's what science does. We prove people wrong. Is there another universe before ours? That's the question I'm trying to answer.
Wow. Now, so I'm thinking about this in my mind here. Are we talking about some kind of inflation and then deflation and then something starts? Or how are you kind of looking at it, Brian?
Yeah, there's multiple ways that you could have universes that cycle in and out of existence in time. You could have multiple universes that cycle into and out of existence in space, and you could combine those together in multiple universes in both time and space-time. And how do you reconcile that with the passage of time, with the laws of physics that we observe? And so these are different concepts known as the multiverse in either space or time, or the absence of the multiverse. So we're looking at things like inflation, like conformal cyclic cosmology, like something Julian Barbour's talked about, the Janus point, time comes into existence. And so these are truly fascinating subjects for me to study. And we think now with the technology we're building in the Simons Observatory in the high Atacama Desert at 5,000 meters above sea level in northern Chile, we might be able to, in the next construction will hopefully be finished this year, and we'll start observing with some of our telescopes on this high altitude plateau in the driest desert on Earth, trying to find wispy imprints of a previous early epoch in our universe that produced waves of gravity that ripple throughout our cosmos to this very day. And so there's never been a more exciting time. And I think this is going to be cosmology's decade. I think the rise of new telescopes, the Vera Rubin Observatory, also in Chile, the space observatories, the JWST, the successor to Hubble, should be launched this year. It's been delayed for decades, over a decade, but hopefully it'll be this year that launches it. And we peer back, just as Hubble showed us this miraculous vistas of the early epochs in the universe, so too will the JWST take us back and reveal new cosmic information with a greater clarity than ever conceived about. And what an exciting time to be a younger person and have a career to probe the deepest depths of human comprehension and get paid to do it.
Yeah, we're going through like one of the darkest periods in our lifetime right now. Yet at the same time, for me, I'm still very optimistic because I see a lot of good things happening. And when I was growing up,
Yeah.
and I imagine you were the same, but you would probably be thinking the year 2021, we would be interplanetary kind of spacefaring civilization, right? But to me, it's feeling like we're actually now starting to take off. We're actually starting to get there. Does it feel like that to you working in the kind of field?
Yeah, we're definitely reaching this confluence of technology, of awareness of science, of new grasping things that your reach cannot possibly have right now. So interplanetary voyages. I talked to Avi Loeb, professor, former chair at Harvard University, had a book out about this object that came near the Earth in 2017, which he claims is alien technology. And so not only does he think that alien technology has visited the Earth, he believes that there will be many more to come, and that with the onslaught of the new telescopes that I talked about in space and on Earth, and with the advent of inexpensive space travel via so-called CubeSats or maybe solar sails, that we'll be able to visit not only these objects as they come close to the Earth in our solar system, obviously came from outside of our solar system, but from where we don't know. And so that's the next step in evolution. He's involved with a project to send a swarm of tiny cell phone camera lenses, basically attached to sensors, to Proxima Centauri, where we, some claim we had a message transmitted from back in December. I did a podcast with Dr. Jill Tarter, who's a friend of mine, the inspiration for the Ellie Arroway character in the movie Contact, and she's incredibly fascinating. She's very dubious about that coming from an extraterrestrial intelligence. But all these things, it's going to be the advent of astrobiology. I had a podcast with people that said they detected signatures of life, Dr. Sarah Seeger, on the planet Venus, not Mars, but Venus.
Yeah, that was big news
and its
last
atmosphere.
year. Yeah. Any other year,
so
that would have been like, that would have won prizes for being like the headline of the year. But last year, it kind of got lost by the wayside, right?
Yeah, there was a lot of competing for attention. There's aliens. There were flybys.
If we go back to Avi for just a moment, because I see aliens everywhere, Brian. I'm like Fox Mulder. I go looking for them. But when I hear somebody like him coming out, and also the reasoning behind why he thinks it was some kind of alien structure, I tell you what, to a layman, to somebody that's just interested in science, he makes a pretty compelling case. What do you make of his work on
I had a long conversation with him, and he's become a friend, and I have a great deal of respect for him. I never believe anything without verification and trying to confirm it. So I said to him, Avi, you're involved with this project to send little cameras to another solar system. Why don't you take that billionaire, Yuri Milner, who's funding it, Why don't you ask him for, $10 million to send a satellite to Oumuamua, which is this object that he claims came from another civilization, before it's too late, before it gets too far away and you can't catch up to it. And I didn't like his answer as much, and again, this is with utmost respect, but he was like, no, we'll wait, and there'll be more that will come. We'll discover many more, as I said, with the Vera Rubin Observatory, with other telescopes doing surveys in space. And, but there's a concept that you might, it takes a certain set of skill to get lucky twice.
Yeah.
And sometimes you only get lucky once. And what if that was the one encounter that he'll ever have in his life? And here's a guy, it's not just like me telling you, Kev, take all your winnings, from the dart game at the pub and go down it. No, you can't. He knows a guy who's spending $100 million to send a bunch of cameras to a place that we don't know has life. And if he claims this actually came from there, I would put everything on that. And so, but he's incredibly brave. He's taken a tremendous amount of heat because he has gotten so popular. I mean, after he came on, so he came on my show, and he went on the Joe Rogan show and the Lex Friedman show. And so between the three of us, he got like 3 million views. So I take a lot of credit for that.
Lex,
he got three,
I like Lex. Lex is a good guy. Like him.
Yeah, he got 3,010,000 views. So I'll let you guess which of the three of us got the 10,000. But I'm doing my thing. Those guys are great. But he goes on those shows, and what do you think? Some astronomer, who's got no attention, who thinks he's as smart or she's as smart as Avi, and she or he's not getting any attention, they're going to say, oh, he's not serious. He's going on Joe Rogan. He's going on Lex Friedman. No, I think it's phenomenal what he's doing. Scientists have an obligation to be the chief cheerleaders, proponents, and exponents of what we're doing. Who else is going to do it for us? So, hell yeah, if I'm invited on one of those shows, I'm going on. It doesn't mean that that's the venue where science is proven or not, but it's a very callous and jealous thing to say because he's so popular and because, he's gotten so much attention for this idea that he's somehow less, respected. Actually, there was an article written by this guy who writes at Forbes magazine named Ethan Siegel. And Ethan wrote this article, criticizing Avi and saying, that the idea is nonsense and it's not taken serious, that this is alien space. And then he wrote that like he was once respected. I'm like, Avi is still, one of the most productive, incredibly intelligent, even if this turns out to be a total hoax or wrong, he is incredibly respected, so much more so than, I'm not going to say what the end of that sentence, but the point is, people, the higher you fly, the easier you are to shoot down, and people want to take aim at you. He's taking a lot of arrows, and he's incredibly brave. And he's Israeli, and I have a lot of friends in my community that are Israeli, and they're not known for the smooth. The nickname for Israelis are like cactuses. So they're not the like warmest, cuddliest of all folks. But he can take it because the cactus has spikes to protect itself from invaders that want to suck it dry.
I must admit, I think he's brilliant. I like that we see scientists going on Joe Rogan. I want to get back to a time when, young kids are looking at scientists and making them their heroes. Think of how many people might hear Avi and inspire young minds into going into science. That alone, I think it's ridiculous what that kind of journalist was saying. And I tell you, it takes some set of kahunas for somebody with the reputation of Avi to come out and put it all on the line, right? Because, that can't be easy, Brian, coming out like that, right?
No, and it's incredibly brave. He's taking a stand. There's a saying: if you stand in the middle of the road, and this works in the UK too. If you stand in the middle of the road, you get hit from both sides. He's taking a side. He's switching. He's backing it up. He's putting all his credibility on the line. This is a guy, chairman of the Department of Astronomy at Harvard University. This is not a guy to be taken lightly. He's taking a risk. My friend Eric Weinstein, he does the same thing. He's not in academia, so he has a little bit more liberty to do stuff, perhaps without fear of not getting tenure or some repercussions. And Eric goes on Joe Rogan, a couple times a year. Lex Friedman the same way. He actually had his son, Zev Weinstein, was on Lex's show just recently, who is a young man that I have a tremendous amount of respect for and hope for the future that he gives to me for the young people of Generation Z. And these are people that are doing outreach, and it takes a lot of courage, but they're doing it. In part, they get so much attention because so few of the rest of us are doing it and making it a priority. I always say, why don't you learn how to do public speaking to my colleagues? They're like, oh, it's too hard. It's not my personality. I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot. When you were born, you knew quantum electrodynamics. You never had to work at it. You never had to study it or study somebody who was a master and you acted as apprentice. No, you just learned it, right? And they're like, no, but it's different. And I'm like, no, it's not different. If you prioritize it like anything else, it could be like your marriage. It could be like with your kids. You got to like read books, learn from experts, process that, iterate, make the flywheel turn, and then you become good at it. It's not enough to just say, I'm not born that way. I'm going to stay inside my academic hermit shell.
This might tie back into what we were talking about earlier. I think if people could relate more to the science community, that the big names in science, it wouldn't feel like such a closed club, almost like a priesthood. A priest class where it's totally separate from the people on the ground. So I think people like yourself, people like you mentioned there, I think you're doing absolutely brilliant work connecting or reconnecting people to the science and making it interesting again. We're making science interesting again. That's what we're doing here,
Yes.
Brian. Yeah, making it great again.
And it should be. It's like imagine like you're an actor and you're like, oh, all I have is Shakespeare to read. No, it's awesome. We have incredible material, and we never use it, and we allow people to misuse it in our name and then take credit for it, and we allow people to conflate, kind of these awestruck, whatever, and miss the opportunity to make an indelible impression upon young people. And I feel like that's almost a crime, certainly a crime that's punishable by imprisonment in a beautiful villa in northern Italy.
Absolutely. So listen, you work with a lot of the young scientists, I take it. I mean, are you encouraged for the future with what's coming through?
Yeah, very much so.
Good.
I mean, you can spot it. You can tell who's going to make it. I've had 16 graduate students get their PhDs or about to get their PhDs in 17 years. Pretty proud of that. And none of them are unemployed. And that is a testament as much to, kind of their abilities, their intelligence, the gifts that they came in with, but also being open and trainable and coachable and learning these skills that they're not intrinsic. Nobody's born being a good speaker. And I realized that when I had some students from Thailand or China, and that's one of the best things about being an academic, Kev, is I get to meet people. I've had students from Uganda. I've had students from New Zealand all the way to, Montana. So it's incredible. And it's a privilege. And my kids get to meet those people. I get to go to their houses. They get to come to my house. And my kids are going to grow up in so much richer of a culture and environment than I grew up in, even though I had a father who was a professor. I mean, we talked about that last time. He's the sort of my memoir is about, reconciling with his flaws and his inadequacies as a father. He didn't take advantage of that as a professor. I'll be damned if I'm not going to take advantage of it. Expose my kids to the greatest ideas in other cultures, travel, and bonding over great food, great wine, and I can't wait to get back to it. But yeah, these students give me hope because they come in with a passion. The other day I have a meeting every Friday afternoon going into the weekend. We kind of sit around. Now it's on Zoom, unfortunately, but soon we'll be back in person, I hope. And we had some new students come in and I asked them, just like randomly, what's your favorite book? What'd you read recently? And they're like, A Brief History of String Theory. And I'm just like, holy crap. Like these guys are reading string theory for pleasure. And these aren't nerds. The other book was like, Ursula Le Guin, some like science fiction, and then some like real, nonfiction, Malcolm Gladwell, whatever. And I'm like, wow, this is impressive. This is a person with curiosity. And if you have curiosity, I can take you as far as you want to go. That's my deepest hope. That's what I do at the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination that I'm honored to serve as the co-director of, is we're investigating new modalities to improve, increase human imagination, because it is the most human of all human traits. And to me, and if you'll indulge me in the last couple of minutes, I'd love to ask you some questions. You've had me on your show. I'm going to hopefully get a copy of this and put this on my show because I want my audience to get to know you. But I don't know if there are any other questions before we go what I call into the impossible. Did you have any more things you want to follow up on?
No, I think you've pretty much covered it. Let's go into the impossible, man. I like it.
All right, brother. So every show when I have guests on, I'm honored to have on like you. I always ask them a series of 3 questions. I'll start with the questions that I ask all of my guests. Now, you didn't have any preparation for this. I just sprung this on you. So I'll give you an extra couple of seconds. So I want to know if you can construct a conformal field theory that has less than 8 dimensions, but can unify quantum mechanics with electroweak force.
Yeah, every day of the week. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Good. You beat Frank Wilczek. It took him 20 seconds. That's like, okay, but he has a Nobel Prize. So okay, here we go. You ready? All right. The first question I ask you relates to, kind of the theme of the end of my book, Losing the Nobel Prize, which is that it's what you do outside of the laboratory that makes a big impact on your friends, on your family, on your culture, on your nation, on your world. And for me, Alfred Nobel did something interesting because he endowed the Nobel Prize, which came with some cash and everything, but he was never married, had no kids. And a lot of my audience is like that. A lot of my friends are like that, have no kids, they're not married. And so how do you leave a will? Not just monetarily. Well, first of all, who do you leave the money to if you don't have any heirs? I mean, I'm open. I'll give you my Bitcoin wallet.
Yeah, same here. Just in case. Either way, yeah, it works both ways. Definitely, man.
So yeah. But my question is, what are you going to put in your ethical will? In other words, Alfred Nobel said, here are these prizes. They should only go to the single person who in the preceding year made a physics discovery that had the greatest benefit to mankind. That was the end of it. So in other words, something material going to something that is intangible, that is heterodox, that is different than just the physical discovery of the laws of nature. He said, how did you make the world better? What do you, Kev, when you reach the biblical age of 120 years old, what do you want to put in your ethical will to tell all of humanity as a guide for the wisdom that you've acquired during your time on Earth?
Just to talk, to listen to each other, and not to fall out over the stupidest little thing, and to enjoy the journey. And
perfect.
Try and help one person every day, and by that, you can even just say hello to somebody. Just ask them how they're doing. That can change somebody's world. You can't change the world per se, but you can change the world for somebody around you just by being nice to them.
That's right. Yeah, that's the microcosm. Everyone wants to change the world, have revolution, have, whatever this and that. And they don't realize that the greatest impact they can make is on themselves. And yeah, I love that. That's very stoic. I love it.
Yeah.
Okay, the next question is also going into the future, but a lot further than 120 years from now. Instead, we're going to go 1 billion years from now. So there's a movie called 2001: A Space Odyssey. I don't know if you ever saw it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so it's one of my greatest movies of all time, and certainly my favorite science fiction movie.
Did you not see the monolith that turned up last year? The monolith turned up in Utah,
That's about what I'm about to ask you about. So in that movie, the beginning scene, for those that haven't seen it, has these hominids in Africa, and they come upon this monolith, this structure that's like a time capsule, and they don't know how to interact with it. So they hit it with a bone, they try to push it over, whatever, and nothing works. But another, fast forward a couple 100,000, maybe 1 million years, then astronauts encounter it on the moon and floating around in space. So it's obviously meant to be a time capsule of some kind. We don't know what the purpose is exactly. It's kind of menacing in that sense. But I want to ask you, what idea, book, music, what would you most like to put on a 1 billion year lasting time capsule?
Oh, what a fantastic question, eh? Wow. This podcast?
Yeah.
I tell you, that's a really great question. I seriously would need to think about that. That's quite profound, that, Brian. Wow. I can't think of any one thing. Yeah, that's totally overwhelmed me, that one. That put me on the spot there. I tell you how I would do it, though. I would do it by encoding whatever the message was into stone, for argument's sake. Something that will last. I look at the pyramids and I think there's still a lot of secrets encoded in there. almost like a time capsule. When we can release them,
Okay.
we'll get them. So I would do it along those kind of lines. I would leave something that when we're at a certain level to actually interpret it, to figure out what it is, whatever that knowledge then contains would be appropriate for the level of civilization at that time.
Interesting. Okay, good.
Very
All
vague
right.
and
And the
all
last,
all over the place, but it'll do. It sounded interesting.
it did sound
Yeah.
interesting. I liked it. You know, I was honored to have on Carl Sagan's widow,
Wow.
is a woman by the name of Ann Druyan, and she works on the Cosmos project with Neil deGrasse Tyson. She's an author. She wrote the book Contact with Carl Sagan, who was obviously, the progenitor of many young cosmologists, including myself and Neil deGrasse Tyson and others. But I asked her, what would you put on it? And she's like, oh, I already did that. Like, what the heck are you talking about? She's like, well, she recorded her brain waves on the Voyager 1 golden disk that was sent out into interplanetary space.
Wow.
And that golden disk contains her brainwaves and sounds of Earth and people talking and water bubbling in a brook on a record player. You know, I'm just hoping that they'll have a phonograph needle, in a billion years from
what
now.
would you leave for people? What would you leave?
Well, I always phrase it in terms of like scientific knowledge, in terms of what would you put on the scientific. So I would put a plot showing the cosmic microwave background polarization spectrum, what it looks like. Because in order to do that, you have to have done what Richard Feynman answered this question. He wasn't on my podcast, unfortunately, but but he had a great influence on me. And Richard Feynman said many things. First of all, he said one thing that I quote all the time, which is that science is the belief in the ignorance of experts. In other words, if I tell you this is all known, Darwin was right, Galileo was right, Aristotle was right, and you just trust them, then you're never going to do science. Science will stagnate, and stand still completely. But if you believe that they're not ignorant, but that they don't have all the knowledge, then you'll go forward and create new knowledge. Feynman answered this question that I didn't post him, but he said, I would put the atomic hypothesis that everything's made of atoms. And the further you subdivide things, it goes into atoms. Now, why I would put on my particular monolith, I would put the cosmic microwave background, because the cosmic microwave background is also, in sense, caused by the properties of atoms. So it encodes more information. It can be seen from anywhere in the universe, this pattern. And it would also indicate that we didn't know whether the universe had a beginning or not, or maybe multiple beginnings. So for those reasons, I would put that on there, along with a picture of my wife, because that would be kind of cool. No, I'm just kidding.
As you do.
Honey, I love you. All right, last one is the final question, and it actually owes itself to the origin of my podcast name. Owes itself to the origin, and it comes from Arthur C. Clarke. So Arthur C. Clarke had many laws, one of which was any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And Kev, I actually have his voice saying those words, and that's how I open all my podcasts. Isn't that cool?
No, that is very cool. Yeah.
His other law, another one of his laws, is that for every expert, there's an equal and opposite expert. Kind of little twist on what Feynman said. And then lastly, he says the only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. That's the name of the podcast, Into the Impossible, Brian Keating. So I want to ask you, Kev, kind of advice to your former self. When you were 20, and you're not that old now, maybe 10 years ago, whatever, what would you have told yourself to give yourself the courage that you needed to go into the impossible and create this empire that you're building, that you influence people that you haven't met yet, like such as myself? What would you tell your former self in terms of life advice? And I've gotten all sorts of amazing answers, but I want to hear yours.
A really great question, man. Really good. I look at 20 odd years ago, I was in the military. I was quite a shy guy. Didn't like doing public speaking. If somebody had told me then I'd be doing this now, I'd have laughed them off the face of the earth. I would have. But I would tell myself, just be confident. Be confident and try and do things that make you feel uncomfortable, because they bring the best rewards. Anyone can sit and get complacent and do the things that are easy, but it's the things that really take you out your comfort zone. They're the most rewarding. I find now, looking back, that's when I've learned the most. When I've approached subjects that are really something really alien to me, no interest. When you go and look at that, then you actually find, wow, stuff in here that is interesting. So take that leap. Have a lot more confidence in yourself, and like you say, go into the impossible, because that's where the best stuff lies.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
a beautiful way to end it. That was awesome, Kev. Thank you so much for
No, thank you, brother. Thank
for
you.
obliging and kind of being game and humoring me at least
I
by
like that
doing
on the
that.
spot type thing. I don't do scripting. I prefer to have an organic conversation. So that kind of thing is perfect, brother. Perfect.
That's awesome.
Then if you had
All right,
one
man.
final
Well, thank
message,
you so much for having me on, man. I missed you,
if you've
and
got one,
I'll do it again maybe in a couple months.
yeah, if you've got one final thing to say to the audience about what's coming the rest of the year, a positive message, Brian, what would it be?
Yeah, I would say that you want to look to scientists and you want to question scientists. You want to be like a scientist. I don't know another scientist who just says, oh, a scientist said it, let me just trust what they have to say. Think scientifically, trust scientists when you have a reason to trust us, but you have a stake in science because your financial contributions enable your scientists in your country, scientists in my country, to do what we do. We do it as a privilege. It's an honor to do it. We do it because there's no war going on where governments would need to co-opt our services. But there is an obligation of scientists to act ethically, to expose and reveal when they don't know something. This is another favorite quote of mine by Feynman. He said that the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and the second principle is that you're the easiest person to fool. And after you have not fooled other scientists yourself, you can go on to not fooling other scientists. And after that, you cannot fool the general public. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't trust in scientists. I trust my life to scientists. Every time I go out, every time I get on a plane, every time I do take a vaccine or whatever. So definitely by all means, but think critically, demand answers that you can understand. You're totally entitled to it. And be, as Kev was saying, be excellent to each other. And I think that for me this year, if we can do that, we have a bunch of projects coming on. I hope we'll be able to reconvene again soon, Kev.
Absolutely. Now, just for the listeners out there, remember to go and visit Brian's website and briankeating.com. And also, if you haven't done so already, please get onto his YouTube channel right here. It's Dr. Brian Keating, Into the Impossible. New videos every Tuesday. And when can we look forward to the audiobook coming out, Brian, real quickly before I let you go?
Yeah, so hopefully the Galileo audiobook will be out this year. And then my other book, Think Like a Nobel Prize Winner, will be out before the Nobel Prizes, so in September. So basically, yeah, we have to get together before then,
Yeah,
Kev.
definitely, brother. Thank you so much for
You're
your
not
time.
going to want to miss it.
No,
All right, brother.
no,
Have a
thank
great
you.
day.